So let me say I'm very pleased to be here today. It's an extremely interesting agenda. It underwent a few changes, and I'm especially happy. I'm going to be speaking mostly about the military force withdrawal, Soviet military force withdrawal. I'm very glad, though, that there is also extensive coverage of the intelligence dimension of the Soviet withdrawal, which was less of a withdrawal, partial withdrawal, or imperfect, let's say. And I'm very pleased to see how well that's going to be covered. So I'm going to be, I had to cut a lot of my presentation, and I don't think I'll have time to go into the post-Soviet debate about who lost Germany and about the troop withdrawals, not only from Germany, but also as was mentioned, Twiston mentioned, is there were withdrawals from Hungary and Czechoslovakia, which were completed in the Soviet era, and then in the post-Soviet period, the withdrawals from the Baltic republics, which had been part of the Soviet Union but became independent in August 1991, and then from Poland, which had been delayed for reasons I'll get into here, and then from Germany. All of those even from Czechoslovakia and Hungary, but particularly the post-Soviet withdrawals were buffeted by political concerns, and I'll try to convey some of these. So, whoops, what did I do? So the drastic changes in Soviet policy toward Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, the collapse of communist governments throughout the region, the reunification of Germany, and the integration of United Germany into NATO, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact provoked strong anxiety among high-ranking officials in the Soviet Communist Party, whose position in Soviet society had long been buttressed and legitimized by the maintenance of a wider socialist commonwealth. They saw that as contributing to their legitimacy and the legitimacy of the Soviet Union as a whole. So the upheavals in Eastern Europe also sparked dismay among Soviet military commanders, and I'm going to be focusing mostly on the role of military commanders, although I also will look at Communist Party officials. After nearly 35 years of close cooperation within the Warsaw Pact, including a special Soviet East German military alliance, Soviet military officers were deeply unnerved by the far-reaching political changes that began in the latter half of 1988. So even before the whole structure of communist regimes collapsed, you could already find significant expressions of disquiet in Soviet military publications, in particular, where they were started suddenly glorifying the 1956 invasion of Hungary and the 1968 intervention in Czechoslovakia, which they of course had done in the past, but suddenly articles began appearing about those events, which was not by accident. So the Soviet military officers watching what was going on in East Central Europe and the unwillingness of Mikhail Gorbachev and other senior Soviet political leaders to crack down deeply worried them. So in an interview in early October 1990, on the day that Germany was reunified, the chief military advisor to Gorbachev, he was then the chief military advisor, Marshal Sergei Akhrameyev, acknowledged that many of his colleagues in the armed forces were appalled by what had taken place in Eastern Europe. So I'm going to quote Akhrameyev here. He said, "This new course has not been easy for us in the armed forces, not easy at all. We are military officers, and as such, we were accustomed to regarding the Warsaw Pact and our forces stationed on the territory of the German Democratic Republic, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary as the bedrock of the Soviet Union's security. For us as military officers," referring to the Soviet High Command, "the entire security system that was created after the war was the foundation on which everything else was based. The destruction of the whole foundation, even with the transition to a new security system, naturally has been a very painful and difficult process for us. This, again, was while he was still an advisor to Gorbachev, but he was not leaving any doubt about where his sentiments lay. Subsequently, Akhrameyev expressed, quote, great anguish, unquote, about the events in Eastern Europe and said, quote, it has been excruciating for me as a communist veteran to watch what is happening to our country. I cannot bring myself to participate in the destruction of our military alliance, unquote. He emphasized that he himself should have, quote, fought relentlessly and uncompromisingly against those who set out to discredit and destroy the Warsaw Pact, and who are forcing the Soviet Union to give up its wartime triumphs in Germany. This, again, was all, he was saying all this in the context of German reunification and the beginning, or the layout of plans for Soviet troop withdrawal. So, although senior Communist Party officials and Soviet military commanders initially were reluctant to voice doubts in public about the wisdom of Mikhail Gorbachev's policy toward East Germany, the rapid disintegration of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, actually by this time had been renamed the Western Group of Forces, but because the group of Soviet forces in Germany is a more familiar designation, I'll use these interchangeably. And the increased hardships facing Soviet military personnel as they withdrew from German territory, particularly the lack of housing for them on Soviet territory, turned the issue into a source of open controversy and debate. The debate generated deep splits within the political elite and tensions in civil-military relations in the USSR, and it was one of the factors that prompted the hardline coup attempt in Moscow in August 1991. I'll come back to that in a minute. Unease within the Soviet high command about developments in Eastern Europe began emerging as early as 1987, as I mentioned, and increased precipitously later. The events leading to the downfall of Erich Honecker's regime, the opening of the Berlin Wall, the demise of East Germany's communist government and state security apparatus, well, not demise, but but certainly great weakening. It caused particular consternation. Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov later recalled in his memoirs that he had felt that his, quote, whole life was being betrayed, unquote, as he watched what was happening. So despite those sentiments, which were widely shared by other Soviet generals, the norm of civilian control of the Soviet armed forces was still so entrenched that it induced caution on the part of high-ranking military officers. Neither Yazov nor other Soviet commanders voiced their dismay in public. They did privately, but not in public, as the crises in Eastern Europe were unfolding. Hints of consternation in Moscow did surface from time to time, and on at least one occasion in late November 1989, Yazov exploded with anger when a Western journalist asked him about the Velvet Revolution underway in Czechoslovakia. But that outburst was the exception rather than the rule. For the most part, Soviet military commanders were unusually reticent in their public comments about Eastern Europe in late 1989 and early 1990. And although Defense Minister Yazov, quote, regarded the events of 1989 as a personal affront and a great tragedy, unquote, he made no mention of that at the time. Only later in his memoirs did he reveal what he had truly thought at the time. In December 1989, the commander of the USSR's southern group of forces in Hungary, there was a central group of forces in Czechoslovakia, a southern group of forces in Hungary, and then what was renamed the western group of forces in the GDR. This was Colonel General Matvei Borlakov at this time. He later became commander-in-chief of the Western Group of Forces in Eastern Germany, but he, at this time, was commander of the Group of Forces in Hungary. He argued that the deployment of Soviet troops in Hungary was still justified, quote, for strategic reasons, and that any reduction of those troops could be realized only in a well-considered manner, unquote, with strict reciprocity by NATO. The complete withdrawal of the southern group of forces, Bulakov implied, was out of the question, short of a drastic change in NATO's forces. So this was December 1989 when he made these comments. Another Soviet general, Mikhail Yasyukov, made a similar statement about the Soviet Union's western group of forces in eastern Germany, describing it as, quote, the most important link of the Warsaw Pact, unquote. The continued presence of those forces in eastern Germany, Yasyukov maintained, was essential so long as, quote, anti-socialist and revanchist circles in the West still pose a threat, unquote. Both Borlakov's and Yasyukov's statements were obviously intended to help deflate the pressure that was building for the unilateral withdrawal of Soviet troops from Eastern Europe. Their remarks pointed to what became a rancorous debate that came to surround this issue once the withdrawals began, and until they were completed, even after they were completed. So in the wake of the 1989 upheavals, most Soviet Communist Party officials and military commanders initially refrained from voicing their misgivings in public about the convulsions, but within a matter of weeks, this brief period of quiet came to an end as circumstances both inside and outside the Soviet Union helped trigger a barrage of public criticism. At a plenum of the Communist Party's, Soviet Communist Party Central Committee in February of 1990, regional Communist Party leaders and other senior officials complained about, quote, the destruction of our buffer zone, which included Eastern Germany, Buffernayer zone in Russian. That phrase became commonly used about Eastern Germany and certainly about Poland. So about the destruction of our buffer zone, the growing fissures in the socialist military bloc, the betrayal of our country's victory over German fascism, and the, quote, humiliation that the small East European countries have inflicted on a great power like the Soviet Union. It echoes of Putin here, but anyway, at the very time that the debate over the loss of Eastern Europe was getting underway in February, March 1990, external events were undermining what little was left of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Under pressure from Czechoslovakia and Hungary, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its entire, again, this is just a few months after Borlakov had made those comments that it would be unacceptable to withdraw Soviet troops from Hungary. And so the Soviet Union did agree in March of 1990 to withdraw its, February and March of 1990, to withdraw its entire southern and central groups of forces unilaterally by mid-1991. The Hungarian and Czechoslovak governments had called for the Soviet troops to be removed by the end of 1990, but they were willing to accept the extra 6 months, knowing that that would be better than being turned down for the shorter time frame. So the future of Soviet military forces in Poland and East Germany also was coming into question. And there was no longer any doubt that the Warsaw Pact was disintegrating. I review this process in great detail in a book that I have coming out. Actually, it was supposed to be already out, but Cambridge University Press delayed it, so it's going to be out, I think, this month or next month on the demise of the Warsaw Pact. But only 3 small joint military exercises involving Soviet and East European forces were held in 1990, all in the first half of the year, compared to 25 that occurred as recently as 1987. By mid-1990, the Hungarian, Czechoslovakian, East German governments all had announced that their forces would no longer take part in Warsaw Pact military maneuvers, and some East European officials even began raising the possibility of moving toward NATO once they left the Warsaw Pact. So against that backdrop, Soviet political officials and military commanders no longer refrained from criticizing the policies that in their view had, quote, destroyed the cohesion and combat readiness of the Warsaw Pact. They regarded the prospect of a unified Germany as both a symbolic negation of our victory over fascism and a grave danger to Soviet security. They also expressed fury that troops were being pulled out of Eastern Europe and were not given housing in the USSR. They were often forced to live in communal apartments, which were really pretty awful places to live in. But the growing disarray in the Warsaw Pact, the mounting problems caused by the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and the outcome of the elections in East Germany in mid-March 1990, which everyone knows, greatly accelerated the process of German reunification. It made clear that there wasn't an alternative to it, and it increased the visibility of the high-level debate in Moscow about the loss of Eastern Europe. The Soviet Politburo itself was divided on the matter, but increasingly there were recriminations against those who were seen as responsible for what happened. Gorbachev, particularly Soviet Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze, and the chief advisor to Gorbachev, Alexander Yakovlev. In May 1990, the Soviet Army suspended the limited force withdrawals from East Germany that had begun in the spring of 1989 as part of the reductions that Gorbachev announced at the United Nations in December 1988. That's when he announced unilateral reductions in the GDR. And the Soviet Union's 12th Guards Tank Division, which should have been disbanded in the late spring of 1990, was instead retained in the elite Third Shock Army near the East German-West German border. The pullout of 2 other Soviet tank divisions from the GDR also was put on hold. Although Soviet officials soon announced that they would disband 3 tank divisions in the Western USSR to, quote, comply with the spirit, unquote, of Gorbachev's earlier pledge, that gesture was merely cosmetic. According to Soviet military spokesman, the moratorium on Soviet force reductions in the GDR stemmed from the Army's desire to compensate for the, quote, new military strategic situation that arose in Europe after the events of late 1989. Of particular importance in this regard were the prospect of German reunification and the impending withdrawal of all Soviet troops from Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The chief of the Soviet General Staff, General Mikhail Moiseyev, cited these, quote, changed external conditions, unquote, in arguing that the path of unilateral reductions and initiatives, which we have been pursuing for several years, has now come to an end. And he implied that any further unilateral cuts would, quote, ignore common sense and underestimate the real dangers that exist, unquote. In June 1990, Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze replied directly to the, quote, accusers in the Soviet armed forces and the Communist Party who had complained about the Soviet Union's failure to prevent the upheavals in the Warsaw Pact and the, quote, hasty and untenable withdrawal of Soviet troops from East European countries. I'll skip some of these quotes, but mainly, I think if I had more time, I think I would read them out because they're quite striking and reflecting that there was a genuine debate underway in the Soviet Union. It was about crucial circumstances that had arisen, and there were fundamental disagreements about the wisdom of what had happened and also the implications for Soviet security. It poisoned the atmosphere in the final 2 years of the Soviet Union's existence. So the only point on which Shevardnadze agreed with hardline Soviet military critics was that the, quote, social aspects of the force reductions and troop withdrawals had been badly handled, unquote. He acknowledged that the government had committed a, quote, major blunder, unquote, by overlooking the needs of returning servicemen, and he promised that his ministry would, quote, urgently rectify the matter, which didn't happen. It happened some, but not sufficiently. So in a thinly veiled rebuttal of Shevardnadze's upbeat remarks, General Ivan Mikulin Mikulin, there's a typo there, the head of the military political directorate of the USSR's Southern Group of Forces, accused the Soviet government, especially the Soviet Foreign Ministry, of, quote, openly betraying the idea of proletarian internationalism and of greatly weakening the defense capacity of our country. Let me also just say, he also accused Comrade Shevardnadze, as he called him, to explain why, quote, our forces must abandon the countries of Eastern Europe in such a slapdash manner, unquote. Mikulin asserted that Shevardnadze got nothing in, quote, got nothing in return after making unwarranted unilateral concessions to ensure that negotiations about arms control would proceed smoothly, and also the what he described as Shevardnadze's, quote, incomprehensible rush to sign agreements providing for the complete withdrawal of Soviet forces from Czechoslovakia and Hungary. And again, these complaints were constant by this point. So I will have to exclude some of them to keep to time. But let me just say that these, you could find these almost everywhere by the latter half of 1990 in the Soviet armed forces, even earlier to some extent. But from 1990 on, it was a bitterly contested issue. General Alexei Kuntsevich likewise predicted that, quote, our country will eventually be overwhelmed by the problems created by our overly hasty withdrawals, unquote. Soviet military commanders also sought to extract new concessions for the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Hungary and Czechoslovakia. At one point, the commander of the Southern Group of Forces, General Borlakov, he was still commander of the Southern Group of Forces, threatened to halt the pullouts from Hungary unless his troops were guaranteed adequate reimbursement. In response, the Hungarian government, I think, argued quite properly that any payments connected with the withdrawal should come not from Hungary, but from the Soviet Union to rectify the, quote, grievous ecological damage, unquote, caused by 4 decades of military occupation, a common feature of all the countries in which Soviet troops were deployed, the appalling circumstances they left behind with toxic waste dumps, with chemicals, and even in some cases residue from nuclear weapons. The Czechoslovak government adopted a similar position, and Soviet commanders, however, continued to emphasize the need for greater compensation. Do I have just a few minutes, Tom? Okay, I'll squeeze out those minutes. So let me just say, let me go to one thing which I think illustrates. Boy, this is longer than and bear in mind I cut this by more than half. Let's see. So there were acute tensions with Poland because Poland had delayed seeking, unlike Hungary and Czechoslovakia, Poland had sought to delay in pushing for troop withdrawals, partly because of concern about the border with what became United Germany, which through the first half of 1990 or so, Polish leaders, Foreign Minister Skubiszewski and Prime Minister Mazowiecki were not pressing for troop withdrawals. In fact, on the contrary, that they were proclaiming that the Warsaw Pact needed to be preserved. That changed in Poland by the latter half of 1990, and so, but by then, because of the change of climate in the Soviet Union, especially among military commanders, there was not agreement on troop withdrawals from Poland. In fact, it wasn't agreed to until after the August 1991 coup, and it ultimately proceeded through October of 1993. General Dubinin, Viktor Dubinin, declared that Soviet forces would withdraw from Poland, quote, on our own terms, unquote, and would remain on Polish soil for at least another 5 to 6 years, whether, quote, whether the Poles like it or not. So that was the attitude at this point in the Soviet military toward Poland, and it became even more contentious during the debate about German reunification and the troop schedules. Dubinin said that he denounced the Polish government's alleged attempts, quote, attempts to enslave the northern group of forces. And I'll just read this and end on this. He said, because the same sentiments pertained during this time to the withdrawals from Eastern Germany, which for different reasons became contentious. But this is General Dubin, and I'll read this out. We have fulfilled an internationalist duty in Poland for more than 45 years. Throughout this time, we ensured peace in your country, telling Poles this, and deterred any possible aggression and provocations. I am ashamed that my officers and men must endure the humiliating conditions the Polish side is putting forward. I'm ashamed for the older generations of Soviet soldiers who liberated Poland. I am doubly ashamed for those who perished. I demand that the Polish side stop these attempts to humiliate representatives of the Soviet Union. Who gave you the right to dictate humiliating and deliberately unacceptable conditions and to mock a great power like the Soviet Union? Suffice to say that these complaints and the hostility that was generated within the Soviet military and parts of the Communist Party did, in fact, delay very significantly the troop withdrawals from Poland. And much the same was true in, again, different circumstances with respect to the pullouts from Eastern Germany. And in both of those cases, the pullouts were not completed until well after the Soviet Union had broken apart. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through the debates that followed the breakup of the Soviet Union. They were quite different in some ways, but still were very acerbic and often reflected angry emotions about what had happened. So the long and the short of it is that the debate within the Soviet military, which was slow in getting off, soon by 1990 especially and into 1991 became a huge factor that potentially could have derailed the troop withdrawals, including from Eastern Germany. It didn't, though, and for the most part, the withdrawal schedules were met. That is, there was no instance in which, even from the Baltic states and from Poland and Eastern Germany, the troop withdrawal schedules were met, which I think is looking back from today's perspective 30 years later and what is going on now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's quite a remarkable feat. And so the debate wasn't sufficient to knock all of that off track, but potentially it could have, and certainly in later years it very likely would have. So thank you.